Well, in the U.S., the political infighting is threatening to shut down the federal government. The House of Representatives has voted to delay President Barack Obama's landmark healthcare restructuring law for a year. Democrats in the Senate have vowed to stop this move. Well, our U.S. correspondent Simon Marks joins us now from Washington. Simon, afternoon to you. So how did it come to this?
Well, we are on the brink here of a government shutdown, Nikiwe, because of the ongoing polarization in politics here in Washington, D.C. We saw this earlier in the year. You'll remember the fiscal cliff, the sequester. We keep coming up against these deadlines, and at the 11th hour and 59th minute, the question is always, will the Republicans and Democrats be able to strike a deal? In this particular case, the real question is, will the House of Representatives and the Senate be able to strike a deal to keep the U.S. government open? And it increasingly looks like they will not. We are now less than 13 hours away from the money officially running out and from the government officially shutting down. And there is this enormous standoff on Capitol Hill between Republicans, many of them very ideologically driven in the House of Representatives, who say that they will only fund the government if they are able to strip funding for some of President Obama's healthcare reforms, very much the centerpiece of his first term in office, and Democrats, and it has to be said some Republicans in the U.S. Senate, who say, no, we're simply not going to go along with that. These two issues, funding the government and healthcare reform, should be kept separate. So this is a standoff at the moment, seemingly with no solution in sight.
Simon, remind us, if you will, why Obamacare has caused such controversy.
Well, it's caused controversy because if you are an ideologically driven Republican, you will argue that this is the first stage towards a government takeover of the American healthcare system. If you're a Democrat, also in some ways ideologically driven, you'll argue that philosophically Obamacare is very important because it's going to extend the amount of health insurance coverage available to those people in the United States, and there are millions of them, who have today no access to health care, but as of tomorrow, when the new system is due in some fashion to kick in, they will be able to access relatively low-cost health care coverage. So this is a real philosophical division. It's an ideological division, but it's also being used by the Republicans and Democrats to try and score points against one another. Very clearly, the Republicans in the House of Representatives want to drag the word Obamacare through the mud, because they are hoping that they're going to be able to bruise and damage President Obama's long-term legacy. The Democrats, by the same token, recognize that Obamacare is one of the landmark achievements of his first term in office, and they are determined to try and keep it in place to some degree, and also perhaps at the end of the day, when Barack Obama leaves the White House, to point to the events of this particular day and say, look, how on earth could President Obama possibly compromise and work with this kind of ideologically driven Republican?
So tell us, Simon, if lawmakers do not find some kind of resolution tonight, as it were, what impact would a government shutdown have?
Well, I can tell you federal government workers are bracing themselves for the impact. I was talking to one government worker over the weekend who told me that in her office, everyone this morning was going to be going to work wearing what they referred to as furlough casual, dress-down clothes, because they didn't think they were going to be in the office for very long. There is a real impact on some of these federal government workers. If they get sent home, they will be off work without pay unless and until they are brought back to work by some sort of political agreement. And it's not clear that they will be paid necessarily for the period that they are off work, because that depends on the nature of any compromise that is agreed ultimately between the Democrats and the Republicans. It means that if you're planning a trip to the United States, visa processing is going to take longer. It means the country's national parks will shut down. Many of its museums here in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institution, the National Zoo. Now, there will be those who say, look, America can live without a national zoo for a relatively temporary period of time, but it does have an impact clearly on the people who work there, and a potentially very large impact on this city economically, Washington, D.C.
Simon Marks, as always, he's in Washington for us. Thank you so much for that.
News that moves. eNCA.com.